Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Geospatial Location and Big Data in M&E. That is the first EES webinar in the series of emerging data landscapes in monitoring and evaluation. I was thinking, let maybe give 1 minute for people to join. And in the meantime, I can quickly go through housekeeping rules and then introduce the agenda. So as you can see, this event would last for 1.5 hours. And we are live here in Zoom webinar as well as on YouTube. And the webinar is recorded. Your microphones and your video are deactivated for the mutual quality and sound for all the participants and presenters. That is why please use the chat box for your comments and questions, especially after the presentation of case studies. And you can do the same in comments in YouTube. If you would like to post about this webinar, and please do on social media, please use the following hashtags @EES_eval or #EESEval. So, May Pettigrew from the Board of Directors of European Evaluation Society, just in some second will introduce this new series of webinars on behalf of the Board of European Evaluation Society.
Hi.
Then,
hello everybody, and welcome to this, the first of a series of webinars that the European Evaluation Society will be putting on, either as a single body on its own or in collaboration with some other partners. And we are delighted as an EES board to welcome you all to this in the first of the series. And we'd like to say that we hope that you will follow us on our series, which if you keep abreast of things on the EES website, you'll see the programme which is currently under preparation, but will include 2 basic strands of activity in terms of the content and orientation of the sessions. One strand will be looking at a more transformative agenda for evaluation, and the second, which focuses more on new techniques and practices for evaluators facing these troubled times today, is the first in that particular series. So do have a look at our website and do sign up for our future webinars. We are planning to shake him up, as they say, in these troubled times when we have so much turbulence, so much complexity, where we feel that things are daunting. In fact, what I think you'll find from this in the first, and I hope all the others in the series, I think what you'll find is that we have some really, really wonderfully adept evaluators able to talk to us about how they are using these troubled times to develop new ways of thinking about evaluation tools and methods, and how to see this as an opportunity for transforming our practice in very, very exciting ways. And we hope that the rest of the seminar series will encourage you also to think both about the practice of evaluation, but also we will have some keynote seminars that will be looking at a bigger picture of what do we need to do in these times of immense environmental degradation, in times of social and political turbulence. What can evaluators do to better effect change in a positive direction? And what might we need to do to transform the way we think about evaluation as well as its practice? But let me quickly now get on to the agenda in hand. We have such a packed agenda for you. There's no time for beating about the bush. We have today, first of all, a presentation from Estelle Raimondo, who's the Senior Evaluation Officer at the World Bank, and she's going to talk to us about evaluation and emerging data. And she'll be looking at some of the issues that emerge from applications in practice and drawing our attention to where there are opportunities, but really where there are things that are quite problematic and need further consideration. We'll then be looking at a case study, which Anupam, I'm terribly sorry, Anupam Anand and her name are going to present, and they're going to show us how geospatial methods are being used in evaluations. And Her is a senior evaluation advisor at the European Commission, and Anupam is an evaluation officer at the Global Environmental Fund. This is followed by another case study from Joachim van der Kastelen, who is a young professional at the World Bank. And he's going to look and show us with some exciting pictures, some observations from space that you can't observe from the field. That's his title. And then we're moving on to Alexandra Robinson, who's going to talk to us about the organisational barriers to adopting new data types for M&E. And she has, and I hope we've got the link to it, co-author of Big Data to Data Science, a major piece of work that involves a number of contributors, including Linda here. And so please do check that out as well. It's making a significant contribution to our debates about data and big data. Linda Raftree is going to follow on and facilitate some discussion. So you'll get an opportunity to pose your questions there in the chat box. And we will then have our closing remarks from Valentine Gandhi. Before I hand over, I'd just like to thank very much our partners and contributors to this first session. We are particularly indebted to the Development Cafe, and in this case to Valentine Gandhi, who has warmly supported this seminar with some excellent resources, and we really appreciate that. And we're also very appreciative of our support from Linda Raftree at MERL Tech, who has been our partner in this, as well as our World Bank IEG partners. So please enjoy the seminar and enjoy the follow-up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, May. I have the privilege of introducing the first speaker, who is Estelle Raimundo from the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. And Estelle is going to tell us about evaluation and emerging data and what they're learning in their work from early applications. So over to you, Estelle.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Yeah, I have the privilege to open this series. So my goal today is to really set the stage for a broader discussion, and I hope to, impart a few thinking touchstone for you as you go through the different really great examples that we have today. So I'd like to do three things with you this morning. The first is to discuss, what difference data science and emerging data is making to evaluation and how it's helping us move away from business as usual with a little boost from the COVID-19 crisis that we are all living. The second thing I'd like to do is to share some practical lessons that we are learning from early adoptions in our work at the Independent Evaluation Group of the bank. And finally, I'd like to leave you with a few reflection on the institutional implications of adopting emerging data. So next slide, please. So, if there is such a thing as business as usual, how can we depart from it? In some ways, COVID-19 has been presented as a revealer of some of the long-known issues in development work, and it is also hoped that it will become an accelerator of change. And we could say that this analysis could be extended to evaluation. In some way, next slide, please, Lauren. In some way, COVID-19 has acted as a revealer of some of the long-known issues with evaluation practice. Some of them are, ethical challenges. of weighing the risk and reward of evaluation and making sure that when evaluators are there, they are really in the fray of things and adding value to programs. The second set of challenge is more conceptual, and the fact that evaluation needs to question some of the underlying assumptions of the policies and the programs that we are evaluating, and not just taking them as a given. And COVID has also really put a kind of a lens on these assumptions. And the third challenge is methodological in nature. And in some way, I think COVID has been a revealer of some of the over-reliance on particular types of approaches in evaluation, of which some groups are more guilty than others, but this flyby evaluation or these quick case studies, and these are no longer really possible currently. So we have an opportunity to move from standards evaluation approaches and be creative. And that's where emerging data comes in. Next slide, please. So, at IEG, we've done some reflection and we've written a couple of blogs that you may want to take a look at with a decision tree thinking around, around what can we do when we can't go to the field, or what can we do when we can't have all the slew of interviews that we were really dependent on. And so it's hopefully going to be an accelerator of change. So we've been trying to experiment with different type of emerging data. Some are geospatial, and Joachim will discuss some of these examples, one particular example today. But we also are trying, artificial intelligence and machine learning on text analytics, which will be the topic of the second webinar, and also experimenting with social media data. On the geospatial side, we've had quite a few experiments. The first in a series was to look at assessing the targeting of World Bank interventions in Mexico using boost data, so it's budget data that's geocoded. We've also tried to use drones to study land patterns in Niger. We've used satellite imagery to look at road improvements in Mozambique, and there is the example of Madagascar. So these are all, small experiments that we are learning by doing in some ways. Next slide, please. We've also tried to really make the most of the vast amount of textual information that we have, and sometimes our brains can't wrap their minds around it. So we've tried to tap into machine learning. We've experimented with in-depth content analysis using knowledge graphs, specifically on the nutrition evaluation. And based on all of these experiences, I have a couple of practical lessons to draw with you. That's the next slide. So, there are four things that I think are really important when we think about the practical aspects of using emerging data. The first is to reflect on applicability. Before launching in an experiment, we had to consider whether there was a potential application to not only serve one time, but could be replicated, or we could look also at whether it was better to use emerging data and big data on a large portfolio or actually on a small case study. And it might be counterintuitive, but we found that it was in some way much richer to apply big data techniques on, what Albert Hirschman would call, thinking big ideas at small scale. So most of the examples that I have cited and that you will see today are actually looking at a very specific type of intervention that can then draw lessons and have generalizability, but they are not looking at very, very large portfolios. So that's a first lesson. Next slide, please. The second lesson has to do with the issue of data access, and Alex will talk a lot about this, and the different barriers to access. What we have found in our practice is that it's less the availability of data and more the capacity of making use of it, of knowing how to clean them, analyze them, that has been the challenge, because we have increasingly, open source data, and the bank has been quite good also at opening the data catalog, including on geospatial data. So data is more and more available, and it's more the skill set that remains important. Next, please. So the third lesson, and probably the most important one that I can draw, is the need of a real knowledge brokering process. And Michael Bamberger and others who have really encouraged us to use big data revealed that it's important to have a partnership between data scientists, domain experts, and evaluation experts. And having the right combination is really key. Next slide, please. Finally, the fourth lesson is around mitigating biases in data science and in artificial intelligence. And there, I'd just like to share two thoughts. The first is that there is increasing research on the biases of AI, and evaluators need to keep abreast of that. But we also have to realize that emerging data can also help us shed light on biases of conventional data. And there is, for instance, new research on using social media to look at the trust that people have in governments and their likelihood of entering census data, which then sheds light on the biases of census data that are used widely. So to finish up, because I'm running out of time and I would love to have a bit of time for discussion. Next slide, please. Two thoughts on the institutional implications of using emerging data. And here, I think as a community of practice, we need to keep some healthy dose of skepticism. Not really reluctance, but just keeping an eye for our own practice. There are two risks that I would like to highlight. The first is that the use of emerging data and the use of remote data might exacerbate the use of evaluation as more of a control mechanism that is really top down. And there is a bit of an institutional road that has been taken in many organizations of having evaluation less as a learning and more of an accountability tool. So we have to keep that very much in mind. The second risk is that it exacerbates some of the ingrained biases and also a divide between well-endowed evaluation functions and maybe evaluators who are trained in the north and evaluators who are trained outside of these different data sciences. So it's very important that in the capacity building and also in thinking about monitoring and evaluation systems of governments, that the practice of emerging data is really well shaped there, so that we have a much better all-around community of evaluators and data scientists working together. I was a little over time, so I'm sorry, but I'm looking forward to being in a dialogue with you on these topics.
Thanks so much, Estelle. And we're collecting any questions in the comment box, and we'll be pulling those together so that we can address those during the comments portion of today's event. So I'm going to move straight into the next presentation, which is around geospatial and big data and location data that's being used for M&E. So welcome to Anupam Anand and Hur. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Linda, and hi, everyone. And thanks, Estelle, for setting the stage. So geospatial science is relatively an evolved discipline, whereas the field of evaluation is still in its early stages and is always looking for methods in other disciplines. And having crossed the bridge between these two, I will provide a glimpse of my experience in integrating both through this short talk. So let's first understand what is special about geospatial. Next slide, please. So on the photo on the left depicts a part of the real world. There's a lot of information, but not all of it might be useful for us. On the right is the simplified geospatial model, and you can see the world split into layers of relevant information on the physical environment, on socioeconomic conditions, on land use, etc. The information could be from various sources: satellites, drones, surveys, field visits, or the data from e-devices. And what is common in all these data layers is that we know their location. The spatial information or the location information binds all these data sets together. So geospatial methods or models such as this open up possibilities for obtaining evaluative evidence, as they allow pattern analysis, trend analysis, change detection, understanding the interrelationships, etc. As I mentioned earlier, that the geospatial methods have been there for a while. However, there are two main reasons for its growing opportunity and application in various fields, including M&E. Next slide, please. First, there has been unprecedented flow of spatial data from various sources, particularly the satellite data. We have about 2,100 operational satellites, and of course, this excludes the spy satellites, that are taking various measurements at timely intervals. Moderate and coarse resolution data is free, and the high resolution data is getting cheaper and widely available. Next slide, please. The second opportunity is driven by the recent development in data science. The infrastructure and tools to deal with enormous geospatial data or the big geodata has grown. The availability of APIs, cloud-based services, browser-based development environment allow access to geospatial data and its analysis without the need for big computational infrastructure. The traditional statistics are often not capable of dealing with the volume and the variety of big geodata. And here, the development of machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms that are data hungry, and they help us use data sets to get valuable evidence. And all these have become easily available and accessible. 10 years ago, when I was in graduate school, only doctoral students and professors were using these. But now it's common to hear undergraduates applying machine learning and AI. Next slide, please. Now, that all being said, let's summarize how geospatial data and methods can contribute to evaluation. First, it's efficient. We don't need to visit all the sites. It can save us financial and human resources, and as Her will mention, human lives, as it can be very useful if you're working in conflict or fragile situations. Second, it is not scale agnostic. So the analysis is scalable. One can perform the analysis at the project site, at the portfolio level, or even at the global level. And third, and this is very important, it provides objective evidence and thereby aids transparency. Fourth, geospatial methods and approaches work well in a mixed methods framework. So it complements other evaluation methods. And fourth, on my non-exhaustive list, it helps us deal with common evaluation challenges, such as lack of baseline, finding the right counterfactuals, accessibility issues, all on a shoestring budget. Like any other method, geospatial methods is not the silver bullet. And Estelle talked about biases and other issues that could come with geospatial method, but with any method, there are limitations. And however, when we combine geospatial with other methods, it can be very powerful for evaluation. I will share a quick example from the evaluation of a forest restoration program where we triangulated the findings. Next slide, please.
Just quickly, Anupam, you have about 3 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm good. I only need 1 minute. And, next slide, please. So the best way to assess the project results would have been to measure all the restoration plots. However, this is a Herculean task and time consuming, and it sounds inefficient as well. So the best next thing was to look at the satellite data for the restoration sites. And the before and after satellite data for the project site showed that degradation areas have turned green, whereas the areas outside the project didn't change much. With this kind of analysis, although we knew that the outcome was positive, we didn't know the factors associated with the results. Next slide. This one, yeah, right there. So when I visited the site and conducted interviews, we found that one of the key reasons was reform in land tenure laws that encouraged community participation and ownership of restoration activities. And I think my time is up. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and the European Evaluation Society for hosting us. If you're interested in other examples of application of geospatial methods in M&E, please visit the Jeff.io website. And now over to you, Hur.
Oh, can we go back to a few slides? Yep, the one before this.
Or if you can keep yours to about 3 minutes as well, so that we have time for Joachim and Alex.
Oh, okay. All right. So seems like Anupam, you have taken most of the time, but it's fine. I think that was very useful information. I would actually very quickly introduce where this all started with Anupam and I, who just recently published a blog on European Commission's knowledge sharing platform Capacity for Dev on an example that I'm going to share now. This is Eval FCV, that is a thematic interest group that was launched by the IDEAS, International Development Evaluation Association, which is around some of the issues related to access, measurement, trust, and learning, which Estelle and Anupam has mentioned. So I will move to the next slide, which is about understanding and adapting to the context. So in a fragile environment, or in situations of crisis, or if the situation is very linear, if the causes and effects are linear in a non-fragile setup, the geospatial information, the data that we gather from here is always very helpful. But then in a situation of FCV, where the relationship between causes and effect are not so clear, it will provide you with additional sort of information that you could triangulate and use for your evaluation methodology. Can we move to the next slide? Okay, this is an example that we produced for a guide that is being launched by IDEAS next month. That is Eval FCV, Evaluation of Fragility, Conflict, and Violence. Here you can see two pictures on the left, which are the nighttime light data of Syria and a part of Turkey. You can see drastic change in nighttime light data in Syria, while Turkey remains the same, and you could attribute it to the conflict situation. Let's move to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm just rushing through it, but then I hope we can have some time in the discussion. Another example that Elena just sent the blog to you, you can read more in that blog that Anupam and I wrote, is about an intervention funded by the UK government and implemented by UNOPS. In Sierra Leone, very interesting intervention. It is, I mean, I don't know how many of you know about the electricity in Sierra Leone. Only 2.5% of rural Sierra Leone has access to electricity, while the remaining 97.5% do not have access to it. And the case for this intervention drew from another pandemic, or say epidemic of Ebola outbreak, where, I mean, we don't have the vaccination yet for the current crisis, but then even when the vaccination was introduced, it was very hard for the development practitioners to take those vaccination to those rural villages because there was no cold storage there. So that is where this project came up. So if we move to the next slide, you can see the cold storage in the right-hand side of the right photo. So here, Anupam and I did some analysis, which was then we basically did this for the guide that is being launched, and you can keep an eye on IDEA's website where you can access it. But then here you can, it's very visible that in the first two photos for like nighttime light data from 2012 and 2019. And then you can see the monthly analysis on the left-hand side photo, where you can see that towards the end of 2017, the nighttime light data started going up. And you can also see that in the next photo, where there's a comparison between pre and post project. So, I mean, although as we have been discussing, this is very much based on how an evaluator interpret this data. Well, what we did was we looked into, there are other sources of data gathering as well. Like, for example, there's a qualitative data gathering happening using Sprockler, which is a story-based data collection tool. And then also there is an impact assessment happening, looking into the household income, like impact on the fossil fuel consumption, and the CO2 reduction, and the health. Of course, as the project was basically initiated for health reasons to support the community health services. But then this is a very quick snapshot of what's happening here. Can we move to the next slide, which is actually my last slide? So we wrap it up here. Estelle mentioned before that go ahead with open data sources and tools. There are a lot of institutions, especially universities, which will provide you this open data where you can get this data and play with this. Leverage geospatial methods with mixed method approaches. There's a bit of a noise coming from the background, or maybe it's just me. So, try to mix different methods and approaches in your evaluation methodology, because as I mentioned, the data that you will receive here would, you will have to make sense of the data yourself. So if you have other sources of information, you can triangulate and give a better picture. So variable costs, there are a number of factors that includes like the area you're going to, what is the type of evaluation, what was the intervention, and etc. You may require multidisciplinary team, so try to collaborate. I collaborated with Anupam. We both worked as a team. So you may want to have like specialists of different thematic areas, including, for example, you may want to look into the gender-related aspects of like how light impacts on the gender relationship within a household. There were some cases, as I was previously working on this, where the male households got like even more power with having the light in their house, like the bulb in his room and the television or radio and etc. That's a different debate. And the last point is that there are some online courses available, so you can go ahead and learn more on how to do these kind of analysis. As Estelle very, very rightly mentioned earlier in her presentation, that availability of data is not a big issue these days, but analysis would require quite a bit of a skill. So these courses, Elena in the chat box shared the blog that Anupam and I wrote for Eval Crisis. So if you go there, you will have the links to these courses. So feel free to go online and explore. And happy Earth exploration. Thank you very much, everybody.
Morning.
Thanks so much, Hur and Anupam, for your presentations. We're going to go straight over to Joachim van der Kastelen, who's going to talk a little bit more about observing from space. And then we'll hear from Alex. So you have about 10 minutes, Joachim.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me and providing this opportunity to discuss some of the interesting work that we at the Independent Evaluation Group are doing with geospatial data. And so today I will be talking how one can observe from space when evaluators cannot observe in the field. And I will do so by discussing some of the insight of project evaluation in Madagascar that I'm currently working on. Next slide, please. And so let me start by elaborating the business as usual for project evaluation at IAG. And so for a subset of World Bank projects, the IAG performs independent project evaluations. And so the goal is really to assess the longer-term effectiveness and to understand the why of the effectiveness or the why not. And the focus here is really on additionality. So the evaluation wants to bring in new evidence, and it has to be really added value over and above what has been already documented by the project. And so in the first step, an evaluator performs a desk-based assessment of the project documentation and secondary data that is available. Then in a second step, the evaluator conducts interviews and qualitative data collection during a field mission. And so this field mission is very crucial because it allows the evaluator to better understand the reality that affects the design as well as the implementation of the project, but also to learn on the spot and therefore to fine-tune the evaluation question and the methodology. And in the end, we all want to triangulate the evidence from different data sources. Next slide, please. So I wanted to illustrate how IAG is using spatial data nowadays by the example of the evaluation of a biodiversity project in Madagascar. And so this project tried to address two development challenges in the country. First is the high level of environmental degradation, and second, the high level of rural poverty. And there were two activities that the project supported. On the one hand, it protected and managed protected areas, think of national parks, but it also provided support to the livelihood of the communities that were living around these protected areas. And so the objectives or the outcomes that the project tried to achieve was improved preservation and effective management of biodiversity resources in Madagascar. The second outcome was improved livelihood activities of local communities. And through these two outcomes, the project wanted to achieve the objective of reducing deforestation. But a crucial assumption here is that the project should have been effective in inducing behavioral change away from unsustainable uses of forest resources. And so through reduced deforestation, the project sought to improve the higher level outcomes of biodiversity conservation and rural livelihoods. Next slide, please. So given that travel is now not possible for project evaluation, the use of geospatial data becomes very interesting. And so an evaluator can collect and analyze different sources of geospatial data for project evaluation. And so Anupam already discussed what geospatial are, and he rightfully said that the main benefit is that you can link different sources of information to the same geographical location. So we have the location of these protected areas, we have the support that they receive from World Bank or other institutes, we have a chronological series of forest cover, and we have a whole bunch of external factors like forest fires, land cover, and so forth. And we can all combine this into one geospatial data set. And so the unit of analysis here is at the pixel level that represents the Earth surface of Madagascar. And so this geospatial data can help us to identify the evaluation questions that we want to address. So first, has the World Bank supported protected area been more effective in reducing deforestation? The second question is whether there is heterogeneity in their effectiveness. And the last question is how the World Bank support affected the underlying drivers of deforestation. Next slide, please. But even before assessing effectiveness, we can use geospatial data to explore deforestation over time and space. And so the two maps shown here present the change in forest cover in Madagascar. On the left is before the project, on the right is during the project. And so the red dots, they illustrate deforestation, and the green dots present forests that remain forest. And so by exploring this data, we already see that a substantial part of the forest in Madagascar has been deforested before the project started. But nonetheless, on the right, but it's difficult to see in this picture, is that there are still some hotspots of deforestation around and in protected areas. Next slide, please. So after exploration of the data, one can really start to assess the project effectiveness in reducing deforestation. And so there are different ways to do this comparison. So one can compare deforestation rates within the World Bank supported protected areas with the targets set by the project. Another comparison is to look at before and after deforestation rates of the project. But the more robust assessment is a difference in difference comparison, which combines the before and after comparison with the with and without project comparison. But in any case, it's very important to identify proper counterfactual. That is, what would have happened with the project location if the activities were not implemented there. And so we need to compare terrestrial protected areas with sufficient forest to make sense. We also need to take climate and protection status into account, and we also need to account for the size of the project, of the protected areas. And so when we estimate this difference in difference, what we see on the right is that there is no significant difference in the deforestation rates between the group of protected areas that was supported by the World Bank in blue and the ones that were not supported by the World Bank. But of course, next slide, please. Comparing the average of groups hides a substantial part of heterogeneity in project effectiveness. And so in this slide, I touch upon two dimensions of heterogeneity. The first being the climate, and the second, the type of protection. There could be no access strictly enforced, and there could be some access for local communities. And so what we see here is that we explore this heterogeneity, that World Bank supported protected areas were actually facing much higher changes in deforestation rates over time compared to their counterfactual. And so this is an interesting observation. Next slide, please. Because now we can use geospatial data to try to explore this heterogeneity and link it to the human behavior aspects of it. And so in this slide, what I wanted to do is I wanted to detect whether there is an association between the deforestation rates within these protected areas and the incidence of forest fires just outside the border of the protected area. And so these forest fires frequencies are a measure of human behavior. And that was a crucial assumption in the theory of change, that the project was effective in changing human behavior. And so what this graph shows is that there is indeed a positive association between deforestation rates within protected areas and the change in forest frequency over time. And so on the next slide, we see that geospatial data brings us a step closer to understand the why of project effectiveness. So it can really help to explore the heterogeneity in the quantitative assessment to better understand what is driving this heterogeneity and how the project affected these drivers that are underlying this effectiveness. And so obviously drivers of deforestation are linked with human behavior. And in Madagascar, it's especially the unsustainable agricultural practices, also called the slash and burn shifting cultivation. And so the really interesting question is, how did the project design consider such human behavior aspects when they were selecting protected areas? Did they take into account the level of agricultural productivity in the areas surrounding the protected area? In the next step, we can link these project activities with the observed change in human behavior. So how did the project implementation support the agricultural practices of the local communities around protected areas? But the most important question is whether the project activities effectively affected human behavior. And this is much more difficult to measure from space. And so this is what Hur was alluding to before, is that we really need a multidisciplinary cascading approach where we combine different sources of data to really go deeper into understanding the why of project effectiveness. So to round up in my last slide, so how to use geospatial data in evaluations. So geospatial data allows for a robust assessment of project effectiveness. And so the two main advantages that I see is that it provides an ex ante better understanding of the project complexity, depending on many dimensions of the heterogeneity discussed before. And so the evaluator can ask more targeted and focused questions when you collect qualitative data. And so in this way, and also by exploring the heterogeneity in the quantitative assessment, it can also conjecture to the why in a qualitative assessment. Now, as mentioned before by speakers, there are many downsides as well. And so the possibility to apply geospatial data really depends on the sector of where the project was implemented, the type of the project, and the nature of the activities. So, for example, nationwide policy projects are very much more difficult to assess from space. And it also requires the skill and the knowledge where to find good data, which is a capacity issue discussed before. There are some positive future prospects. There are many user-friendly platforms. For example, the World Bank Maps is a platform where the implementation of recent World Bank projects is linked to geospatial data. And FAO recently launched a hand-in-hand initiative for agricultural geospatial data. And as mentioned before, there are many free and open sources software like QGIS and data from NSA and other sources. So I want to end here, and I want to thank you all for listening to my conversation. So if you're interested in reading more on IEG use of geospatial data, here is the link to a blog that we prepared. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joachim. And if you and other speakers have links that you want to drop in the chat box so that people can find out more about your work, that would be great. Our last speaker today, before we go into the discussion session and the question and answer session, is Alexandra Robinson, who is a co-author of a piece of work looking at big data and data science and what some of the issues are in the sector in terms of moving towards use of big data. So I think Alex might answer some of the questions that are coming in the chat, and we're also collecting them and sorting through them now so that we can present those back to the panelists after Alexandra speaks. Go ahead, Alex.
Great. I'll try and be quick because I want to make sure everyone has room for questions and discussions, but I'm really excited to present some of the findings from our paper that is part of the State of the Field MERL Tech reports, which Linda very bravely spearheaded. And next slide. The State of the Field covers 3 areas of monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. Traditional MERL tech, so those monitoring evaluation platforms that some of us have been using for many years, or in some cases are newer to adopt. Big data and emerging tech. So the paper that I co-authored alongside my fabulous co-authors, Michael Bamberger, Keisha Bergman, and Grace from IDS covers big data. So each of these papers and the broader umbrella paper looks at where have we been in using digital technology for monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. Where are we now? What have we learned? Where are we going? Where should we be going? And how can we get there? In this presentation, I'll focus specifically on barriers to big data adoption for monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. Next slide, please. Next. Great. So just to set the stage for how we uncovered our findings, we looked at we did quantitative analysis of session submissions from 2015 to 2019. So looking at accepted submissions for mentions of big data, context in which big data was presented, and some of the trends around how big data was discussed. We also did qualitative analysis of the session descriptions, coupled with primary data collection through key informant interviews, and then combined with lit review and our own experience as MERL practitioners using digital technology to understand differences across sectors and data types. So there were 6 key barriers that were identified through our research. Next. The first one, which I think many of the barriers feed up into, is just the difficulty of proving returns on investments in using big data for organizations. Second, the lack of funding and donor prioritization, the high upfront cost of technology infrastructure required to use big data, technical skills gap around human resources, the lack of evidence of organizational relevance that's particular in some sectors more than others, and the real privacy, regulatory, and ethical concerns related to using big data in evaluation. Next, please. So first, proving the return on investment for the human and technology and even legal resources required to invest in big data at an organization can be difficult for a number of reasons. I think one of those reasons is the projectized nature of aid funding that isn't amenable towards those upfront investments that are seen as overhead in technology, training, skills, cybersecurity, all of those core things that are required to use big data as an organization well. Having those in a project budget is not necessarily sustainable, particularly for smaller organizations that aren't already using big data. And then arguing for the return on investment can be hard for something that hasn't been done in an organization before, or that's more experimental, when you don't know as tangibly what you're going to get out of that investment. Next slide, please. So across the board, our key informant interview participants that represented MERL practitioners and big data thought leaders across different sectors in international and domestic social impact said that donors weren't prioritizing investments in big data, and that there were untapped resources that should be unlocked in order for the sector on whole to realize the potential of big data. So key informant interviews said that there are a lot of great ideas out there that they would like to explore, but they didn't have the donor support to really allow those ideas into fruition. Next slide, please. And again, the upfront cost of technology infrastructure, particularly for organizations that aren't using analytics or big data already, investing in getting all of that up to speed from cybersecurity perspectives, from just the platforms in themselves, it can be really expensive. And again, due to the projectized nature of aid, make it really difficult to invest in those systems that should be long-term investments that are absorbed into an organization and not just used for one project. Next, please. And again, the skills gap, I think, as the next generation of evaluators and students that had a different education than I did with my very traditional statistics, will be better primed to use big data and different analytical techniques like geospatial analysis, machine learning, and other forms of data science, may be better prepared to use big data than the current sea of practitioners on whole. But these are skills that evaluators definitely weren't expected to have 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, and are just starting to familiarize themselves with, in some ways, on whole. So having access to people readily that have those skills already is not that common at most organizations, and it can be expensive to either train people or hire people to fill those roles, particularly when you're looking at very projectized investments. Next, please. And again, the lack of evidence of relevance can make proving return on investment very difficult. Organizations have finite budgets, so investing in overhead centralized costs is difficult when there isn't a ton of evidence available to say that big data is relevant for my sector, for this area that the organization is working on, etc. The clearest use cases and body of evidence around the return on investment and relevance of big data are largely in agriculture, climate science, environmental programming, and also in health, with GIS and satellite and sensor data being particularly relevant in agriculture and climate change. One thing that's hard for more cross-cutting sectors like democracy and governance, gender, and human rights, there hasn't been a wide adoption and application of big data for MERL for really practical and salient reasons. One we see in agriculture, environment, climate science, etc., and also in health. There are a few things that make that explain why these sectors have been earlier adopters. One is the access to continuous data, so sensor and satellite data for agriculture, environmental, etc., and having satellite data, it gives you a longer, a more consistent longitudinal data set and a higher volume of data to work with. The potential for harm due to ethical reasons, bias, potential injuries for like physical or civil rights consequences for collecting individual data and analyzing that data for democracy and governance, gender, and human rights is a barrier to adoption. And in sectors like health, there's been a longer-term integration of the scientific community and scientific methods into the sector that allows there to be more infrastructure and skill-based available to work with big data. Next slide, please. And here you'll just see some of the examples of how big data is being used in agriculture, environment, and health in ways that are a little bit more solidified than in other sectors. Next slide, please. And lastly, the privacy, security, and ethical concerns are just not to be underestimated. All of our key informants talked about the need for caution in adopting big data and to look closely and introspectively at the costs and benefits of the difficulty of tracking emerging threats and the real concerns around privacy, bias, and impact on individuals and demographically identifiable groups. It's also important to note that the regulatory landscape is evolving and difficult for organizations to keep up with. Next slide, please. Actually, let's skip to the next slide. I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I just presented 6 barriers, and that's not to say that as a whole our paper and our team wasn't optimistic about the future of using big data. We also talk about the benefits and the relevance of big data in our paper as well. But there are a few things that we think can help the sector move forward integration of big data in responsible ways. The first one would be documenting. So honestly documenting the challenges, the limitations, the benefits, the processes involved in using big data across sector and those lessons learned. and also sharing all those lessons learned in community of practice, salons, events, other convenings just like this is really important for the evaluation and global development sector to understand and learn from emerging best practice. And then again, actively seeking to expose ourselves to the new boundaries of big data in a constantly evolving landscape of emerging technology, and being open to learning, but also applying our critical thinking as evaluators as we weigh the costs and benefits of and potential risks of new technology. And then guiding, so coming together to explore standards, guidelines, and best practices, and always keeping responsible use of data and technology at the heart of what we do, and using those standards to guide how we partner with other organizations that may have access to large data sets or technology, like the private sector, in how we use big data in collaboration with others. So I'll just leave it there, and just really excited to hear from everyone and to learn from all the great speakers that spoke today.
Thanks so much, Alex. So we have about 22 minutes that we'll go into some discussion, question and answer. Val and I have been fielding the comments here on the Zoom call and trying to pull in some of the questions and themes that are coming through. So the first one I would like to direct to everyone who was on our panel today, and it's this question about proving the return on investment. Alex raised this, but this was also raised in the questions before Alex spoke. So I wonder if any of you have thoughts around the cost implications of using geospatial, or how you can explain the effectiveness of a project in the framework of value for money. Why is geospatial and big data more cost effective or more effective, more relevant, and how do you make that point to donors or to your institution so that it's something that you're given that space to explore with and to use?
So if I can make one point, I think there is economics of scale in learning and in analyzing geospatial data. So the initial investment is obviously huge, and there are rightfully huge barriers to start and learn and adopt these technologies. But once that you can use them, you can easily set up coding and models that allow you in future evaluations to make benefit of the analysis already done. So I think the initial cost is huge, and there are definitely barriers to address. But in the long term, it does allow for more modeling, more programming, which in itself can also be a barrier, of course. But there are some economics to scale and to longer term, which you don't necessarily have from performing field missions for every project evaluation.
I don't know if Anupam and Hur, if you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I just want to add that now is the best time to convince organizations and institutions that the use of these kind of tools and approaches is so important and imperative. We cannot visit the fields, and we can't do surveys on the ground. So organizations and institutions that have invested in this are better placed than others. So this is a good example for why we need to indulge more into these approaches and methods.
I'm not sure if Estelle or Alex, you have anything to add there. I'm wondering also about this recommendation that Alex had around documentation. Do you feel like there's enough documentation of these different approaches so that we can start to build that database?
Personally, I don't think there's enough documentation, and I think obviously costs vary across contexts, and collecting data in one country it can be vastly more expensive than another country, even though you're solving for the same research question. But I think it's really important to break down those costs and also the time that's involved in that, both for ourselves as practitioners, so we know what we're getting ourselves into, but also for our bosses and leaders that may have unrealistic expectations in either direction about how long it takes to clean data for big data, or clean data to use for big data, and what realistic expectations should they have? I also think that documenting and comparing research question and purpose, what you do get out of using big data versus alternative methods, is really important to weigh those benefits and costs when we talk about return on investment. And I always come back to picking the method that is best fit for the question that you're trying to answer.
Thanks so much. And just because we have a few other questions, I think we'll move on to another one. One of the questions I think is quite interesting has asking about the potential of geospatial for evaluation in humanitarian inventions like food distribution, disaster relief, etc. And I know we're looking at fragile contexts. Does that also include humanitarian situations? And can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I mean, the example I gave from the Syria context and the comparison with Turkey nighttime light data was very much from the humanitarian context. I mean, it could be used for monitoring, for evaluation, as well as to plan. I mean, security and safety of your evaluators, your data gatherers, and the community is very important in humanitarian context, or like non-humanitarian context in settings that are fragile. So you can use this information or this data for multiple purposes. You can use it like where the migration trend, as my colleagues were mentioning, where the people are, how different interventions are affecting the movements and etc. And you can base your own planning on this data as well.
Thank you. I don't know if any other colleagues want to reply to that one. Anupam, looks like you're going to go.
Sure. So I would say that the geospatial data and some of these, I would say, emerging data sets have become crucial for planning humanitarian aid and also for building resilience. When you look at DRR, in disaster sector or even in conflict, these data sets are being used to plan interventions. So we can use the same data sets, but as evaluators, we ask the question in a different way. So are they targeting the right area, relevant area? How, when you're looking at restoration efforts, you can look at the time series data and you can see that which areas and how long did it take to restore, how much money went into it. So you can also do a value for money analysis. So it opens up a lot of possibilities. It's just that it has been used in planning some of these projects for a long time. When you look at SDG, many of these data sets are already coming from geospatial. But as an evaluator, we are, I think, a little behind the curve in catching up in using the same data but asking different questions.
If I may come in just for a second, yes. Not necessarily on the humanitarian, but one of our participants raised a very important point, and I'm trying to rebalance, because we have a lot of enthusiasm, I think, but we also have to remember that not all evaluation questions can be answered only with geospatial, and the participation of people and the processes of empowering also. I mean, evaluations has to really always be this two-way of trying to get data, but also gets the live experience of people. And here I think there was a very important question in the chat, which is how can we combine the two. For now, I think that might be the next frontier, because we may still have our data sets being looked at more and more sophisticatedly. But and then we have another trend, which is more qualitative. But how do we reconcile and really bring the two together and make sure that they work, transformationally both? I think that's the next challenge for us as well. So let's always remember that.
Thanks, and I think
if I can
sorry,
just add one sentence, this is what we call socializing or humanizing the pixels. That is super important, and I can't agree with that more. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on Estelle? Sorry, because at IG there is colleagues of us did an evaluation where they used drones to locally measure land use. And so with this information, they went and had structural interviews with local policymakers and with local community leaders. And so they use this information then to conduct deep dive ethnographic interviews. So this is what many of us has been referring to as this cascading approach of using different data. And I think you can use satellite data for a quantitative assessment to assess effectiveness, but also to identify interesting case studies and then prepare your qualitative participant interviews based on that. So I think it's not, they're complements rather than substitutes. And sorry for interrupting someone.
No, I'm glad you came in with that, Joachim. I wanted to move us a little to this area around personal data protection or group data protection and aspects of how do you get consent when you're using geospatial data. Do you need to get consent? Is it invasive for communities to have geospatial data without them knowing what might be done with it? So that's one angle of the question. And the second angle of the question is really, how do you protect data from potential surveillance of others who you might not be intending would be using that data, for example, governments or the private sector. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts on data protection and kind of the ethics of personal and group data protection when you're using big data and geospatial and mobility and location data.
So I can start. Actually, we are lagging far behind in catching up with the legalities and the ethics of data protection and privacy. So normally it's coming from the courts, it's coming from the policy makers, but as and evaluators, we can stick to the good practices in terms of prior informed consent and it's all there. I mean, if you're using mobility data, for example, you have to read a long form and say yes or no, and and then that data could be used for certain purpose. But I think we are far behind in how some of these data sets that have become available is used. And there are different kinds of data that we have to understand. Satellite data is different from your mobility data or your browser history. They all have different privacy issues and different ethics associated with that. With satellite data is, I mean, I think it's best to practice do no harm policy, because I mean, space is open, anyone can go there and take picture. But I think the starting point would be to do no harm, like don't expose people who are vulnerable. With other data sets, it's much more complicated, and I can speak longer, but I think I'll stop here and summarizing that we are far behind in catching up with the ethics and data privacy.
Anyone else from the panel want to speak to that point?
Sure. I think one of the key gaps and concerns that I see and that were raised in our research were around partnering and the different power dynamics engaged in partnerships. So when a smaller organization is partnering with a larger organization or private sector organization that has access to large volumes of data, that has access to technology, the power dynamics can be off. And we're starting to see emerging examples and templates to use for data sharing agreements. But there's a lot that can be lost in fine print. So I think we as a sector have to share learnings about the different ways to partner, figure out realistically and critically what those boundaries of partnerships should be, and look to different models of partnership where, like data trust, where where data is protected in different ways, and the ways that data is used are more bounded and predetermined. There's so much that can happen after data is used for the original purposes, that may be outside the bounds of original informed consent and may not actually be legal under different regulations, but because big data is so complicated, and there are different levels of understanding and just clarity in these kinds of agreements, it's really, really important to work together as a sector to share our learnings, and share both the good and bad that happens during partnerships, and also the application of big data, so that we can all move forward practically, and not be paralyzed by the complexity, but also be really smart and careful about how we move forward.
Might want to throw this one as well too. Thanks, Alex, to Estelle, because you had mentioned ethical challenges as the first point in your presentation. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this aspect of ethics and privacy and surveillance and consent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with my colleagues here that in some ways we are a little bit behind the curve, but I also think that there are thinkers in our field that have really a lot to propose on not only I think the ethics of data use, but also more importantly, the transformational nature of some of the evaluative activities, and how you put data and the analysis back in the hands of the people we observe, but also we work for. And so here, I think the big players, I mean, the European Union has been putting a lot of emphasis on the data policy and has managed to move us miles ahead and have everyone comply. I think there is a need for a global convening on evaluation and data and ethics, and several of you have put several steps in that direction, but in some ways I feel like it's not salient enough still on the mind of people with power in the field in some ways. So we still have to raise that flag constantly as we use it as practitioners. It's really critical. So no real question, no real answer, just some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks so much. The next area that I want to kind of dip into is there are a few questions around the role of open data, citizen science, open source tools, open source training. One, if you do have tools and training links and you want to put them in the chat, that would be great. But I'm curious about kind of what is the role of open data? How well do open data sets fulfill the needs that evaluators have, or what are some of the challenges there?
I mean, I can get us started. Maybe, and Alex can probably add much more substantive things. I think what's important, and someone in the chat raised the question of, I think it was Tom, on attribution. Okay, because one of the key barriers to data use in general, I think we've made progress, but it's still this question in some way, at least in the institutionalized setting where I work. How can this data be useful to then bring it back and attribute to my project, to my institution, and Alex raised that projectification. So, I think we have really a host of data to explore. Open data are not only, they can be the traditional data. The World Bank is pushing a lot on opening, household survey data, administrative data in the countries where we work. But evaluators are not tapping in that because of that, really hankering on how can we bring that back to our causal chain way to the left side. So I think we need some kind of liberation to be able to also tap into the existing data and move away from that paradigm which doesn't really make sense. But still, in some institutional setting, this is quite a constraint.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, on open data, there are a few things. I think there are not consistent levels of trust in different or open data sources, and not trusting the quality of the data. There are lots of different reasons for that, and some of them are like very practical, but especially if for those of us that have done data collection in constrained environments or even not constrained environments, we see how messy data is, particularly when we're collecting data from human subjects. So I think the cognitive fear around data quality and not knowing something that you haven't been a part of or touched can be a barrier to using open source data. I think lack of standardization around data values, even between tools that are ostensibly the same. So when I was learning data science with Python, I tried to do longitudinal analysis of UNICEF mixed data over time in South Sudan, but the survey had changed almost every year over 8 years, making the process of data cleaning really, really difficult. So I think when we say we want to use open source data, we have to unpack what that might involve. Standards like IATI and other, I forget the name of the humanitarian state standard for data helps, but it's not, it doesn't cover everything. I think another thing, it would be really helpful, and this is something I've tried to do when I'm in the role of a donor and commissioning evaluations, to ask evaluators to research what open data is available that might supplement the data that they're trying to collect. I don't know if that is commonplace across donors or if evaluators are being asked for that, but that's something I've always tried to ask for when I'm wearing the hat of a donor. I want to minimize the burdens of data collection on human subjects. We're often working in areas where people are really overburdened by surveying from different donors from different projects. So I really try and push people towards seeing what's out there that they can answer their research questions and weigh the costs and benefits of timeliness, accuracy, completeness, etc. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to have all the data that you want.
Thanks, Alex. And I think just because we're almost at the end of our time, there's one last question that we'll take, and that's really if you're an international development nonprofit and you want to become more data-driven, but you're facing all these challenges, no donor support, no evidence that will pay off, staff without skills, what should you do? And how can you move in this direction of doing more sophisticated data analytics work, having access to some of these open data sources? So I'd like to hear from some of the panelists, and then I'm going to hand over to Val to kind of close us out. And I know you might have thoughts on that point as well, Val. So really quickly, lightning, maybe 20 seconds from each one of our panelists, so that we can have Val then kind of wrap up and close us out. Estelle, go if you want to go first. And what should you do?
So I think it's continue to take risk, continue to explore, and continue to share the lessons. I think, I mean, the repository sounds good, but these kinds of format where we can, exchange on practice is very important. And also really keep in mind some of the risks that I laid out as we move forward, to have kind of this responsible practice and really think through the risks and the benefits to what we do. But keep trying.
Yeah, Anupam, thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that innovation and risk are two sides of the coin, and you have to take baby steps. And even if you fail, there would be learning. So you take baby steps. Sometime your managers, your institution might not be convinced, but you have to take that risk and move ahead. And once you are able to demonstrate, even with a small case study, then you have more buy-in and you can move ahead. I'll stop at that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I've spent my life in non-profit sector. I mean, so I very much understand this question and where it is coming from. I think further to what Anupam has said, I mean, what you have to really do is, I mean, this big data and this geospatial analysis, I mean, it takes time. I mean, analysis could be really expensive as well. And then it could be harder to convince your management about this, like, new and innovative methods of doing evaluations. I would say that what you can do is to start exploring the like different collaboration options. If you're a non-profit, I mean, of course, you're not World Bank or the UN, but then you can tap into such resources. Try speaking to some universities. Try speaking to some evaluator colleagues like Estelle, Joachim, and Anupam, who are into this field and who would love to collaborate. I think the SDG 17 urges us to, like, to get together to find out solutions all together. So maybe that exploration. There are a list of universities who are interested in sharing data and then providing some sort of support. So that could be one area.
Yeah. Thank you, and we'll try to compile, maybe as we do our wrap up and reporting back, try to compile some information on that for you. Very quickly, Joachim, do you have any thoughts? What should someone do if they're going to move this direction?
So what I think is where we have to move forward and be creative is to link geospatial data with better proxies for human behavior. And I think that addresses some of the remarks and questions about, we're still talking about individuals and beneficiaries, so we need to understand their behavior. And I think linking it up with survey-based data collections, which have GPS location, is an interesting way to link these objective, effective measures with more behavioral indicators.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Alex, very, very quickly, and then we'll pass over to Val. You might be on mute, Alex.
Sorry.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of these points have been covered, but just really emphasizing the importance of sharing lessons learned and being honest and documenting our successes and our challenges and really breaking things down. But I would say thinking thoughtfully about breaking down the proposition of using big data. What is it practically going to involve, and what will you really get, and having that to offer someone in order to convince them, but also using that process to go through the process of confirming or disconfirming your assumptions to yourself and being honest in that way.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alex. And I'm going to end my intervention or my facilitation here and hand over to Val.
Thank you, Linda. In terms of closing remarks, I just have to say that this has been an excellent session. Emerging technology, or also called Fourth Industrial Revolution, has changed how we as human beings live and interact, which is also changing or has the potential to change the way we do development interventions. And sometimes, or most often, these technologies, whether it's big data or geospatial technology or artificial intelligence or blockchain, these are led by tech companies who may or may not understand the context and sometimes honestly do not care. And that is why it's key for evaluators and researchers and social scientists to take the lead in this tech for good or emerging technology space. And one of the first steps is to understand what's out there. That is the idea behind organizing these webinar series. But at the same time, we are and we do not push these as silver bullets. We need to combine them with traditional methods, as some of the comments have been rightly said by speakers as well as by some of the participants. And a solid understanding of the context in which we use these technologies are also essential. And many times we hear about user-centered designs for technologies is going to solve the problem, but often these miss out on how these technologies can be abused as well. And that's why more and more, as Estelle was mentioning, we need to document, learn from each other, and not just have ethical discussions or equity discussions or vulnerability and justice discussion as a nice to have, but as a forefront of pushing these technologies. This webinar is the first of many to come, and we hope to engage more and more grassroots agencies and other partners. So please write to us if you have any ideas, and this is a starting point to have these dialogues going. We will provide the link to the recording, and the questions that cannot be answered, we have a lot still. We will be compiling them and sharing with the speakers, and they will answer them, and we'll produce a blog post. including the links that was shared by the speakers as well as some of you in the audience. So we will be sharing it shortly, and the EES colleagues would share it in. I would really like to close by thanking the colleagues at EES for supporting this initiative, and Linda from MERL for being such an excellent host, and the IEG for the active collaboration for making this possible. And very many thanks to our esteemed speakers who gave such practical and useful examples, Estelle, Anupam, Hur, Joaquin, and Alexandra. We look forward to having you more and more in such webinars. Thank you and take care.